So when I should have been preparing this and focusing really hard, I was actually taking care of a baby, and she's somewhere back there tonight. If she cries, I apologize. What we're going to talk about tonight is the question of why talk about sexuality, especially in the context of a world where some would say a lot of really terrible things are happening. Are we really just fiddling while Rome burns here? And then it's one part history lesson and one part, hey, look at all this cool stuff I found. So we're going to start with the history lesson and talk about what queerness is, what sexuality and gender are, and why queer art is post-human art right now. And then we're going to look at some neat queer art that's come out in recent years. And then finally we'll talk about some questions that are left over, especially for artists, for engineers, for people working in information technology, that focus on sex and gender in our bodies, and what it means to have a queer future, or any future at all. Okay, so why do we want to talk about sexuality, and specifically why do we want to talk about sexuality as artists, or as people working in technology? And the short answer is that art and technology don't happen in a vacuum. So while to you the most important part of doing art might be actually doing and making art, art is part of how we make sense of the world around us. And it's something that's received by the community and used by them to make sense of themselves too. So we have to talk about sexuality in art, and we have to talk about art as critics and not necessarily just as artists, because we need to talk about the political and economic and cultural sense-making that we're all doing. For among various reasons, because we want the world to be a better place, and also because we want art to be a better thing, and artists' lives to be better things. So if I'm saying that we have a responsibility to talk about art, to view art, to try to use it to make sense of the world, then I'm also saying we have a responsibility to fund art, and to fund artists, and make sure they can live their lives and do what they do. So it's two sides of the same coin, I guess. If you want the world to be a better place for artists, then you want to delve into what's political about art and what pushes the boundaries of how we understand our world. Sexuality itself is also a site of regulation of our lives. And oftentimes it's regulation in the form of what's normal, so we don't actually notice that we're being regulated. But sexuality doesn't just happen. As much as we would love that romance movie moment where we fall in love, you know, boy meets girl, we take off our clothes, nobody has any stretch marks or anything, and we leave our bras on the fuck, because why not? As much as we would love that romance story to be true, it's not. So way back when, marriage actually looked really different from what we consider to be traditional marriage now. It was a business arrangement, and it was a partnered arrangement between men and women. There was the assumption that women would work in marriages. There was the assumption that communities would be involved in arranging marriages, because so much of the community's life was held in common, and so much of the community's life was necessary to have everyone pitching in together, that it was actually a really public thing. If you were going to marry an asshole, then the community would come and they would throw a really loud, noisy party out front of your door and keep you from sleeping for days on end, and prevent you from going forward with this marriage. They would take you out and hit you with sticks and humiliate you and have a brouhaha, and otherwise make it impossible for you to have a marriage that wasn't helpful to the community. So it's actually only very recently that this idea of a traditional marriage came into play. And in the 1940s and 50s, because women had gone out to work during the war to get women back into the home, then this idea of the patriarchal family, where the woman stays at home and takes care of the baby, does not bring her to conferences, and the man goes out to work, and those gender roles are really entrenched. That's when it became a tradition. So it's very recent, very Western. Sexuality was also used as a part of the project of colonization. So when people from Western Europe and the UK came to the New World, or to Turtle Island, or to where we're standing now, and said, this is our home now, a part of what they did to make that land accessible to them was to enforce patriarchal norms onto the people who were already there. So to say, no more communal living, let's get married. No more communal baby raising, have your children in your own family. No more cross-gender living. You're either a man or a woman, you're gay or straight, and if you're gay, there's something wrong with you, we're going to get rid of you. So a big part of the project of colonization was making sure that people had sex right in order to make sure that people could be controlled in those little units. And then the final way that sexuality happens to appear very natural, but actually, as I said, regulation is through capitalism. So we live in our families, and we take care of each other, and we love each other, and that's very nice. But at the same time that we're doing this, all of the responsibility that the state could have for caring for elders, for caring for children, for providing medical care, for providing prescription benefits and things like that, is actually downloaded onto this little economic unit of the family. So again, we tell this romance story, we fall in love, we raise our children because we love them, we take care of them, we take care of our spouses and our parents because we love them. But what's happening as this process is naturalized is actually a political decision that's been made to download care for other human beings from the community and from the state to individuals. And that's why it's important to talk about sexuality. So finally, sexuality is a part of how we make sense of the world. And what we're going to look at in the next few slides are various ways that people have used sex as a site of political resistance or as a site of political capitulation to try to make sense of the world that we used to live in and the world that we currently live in. So it starts around 1980. Stonewall has already happened. I think we probably know this, but Stonewall was in 1969. There was a gay and tranny bar in New York City that was raided by the police. Trans women and sex workers in particular, and gay men as well, rose up, rioted in the streets, said we're not going to take it anymore. It was all very Twisted Sister. And that was the beginning of the postmodern gay liberation movement. Before that, there was a lot of political activism. Obviously, there was a lot of literature. There was a lot of undercover writing and art. It's not as though before that there was nothing going on, and all of a sudden, bang, out of nowhere, we have queer movement. But we do have that moment of things coming to a head. So a lot of things that were already building in communities came to a head with Stonewall. And for a little while, especially in queer art and queer porn and gay men's porn, things were pretty cool. Gay men's porn, lesbian porn proliferated. It was distributed farther. More newer, stranger images were produced. On Our Backs magazine didn't just produce dyke porn. They produced really twisted, fucked up dyke porn. Snakes and fat women, images of black women in that weren't degrading, that weren't built into this racialized and racist narrative of the hypersexual black woman or the hypersexual black man with the huge dick. So images that attempted to challenge what people thought of as sex came out. And images that attempted to challenge what people thought of as art came out. But then HIV happened. And again, it's not one of those things where stuff just comes out of nowhere. But if you read the old porno magazines especially, the articles published when HIV was just emerging, for the men who were writing them and the men who were reading them, this really did come out of nowhere. So in these porn magazines, where you expect to find nothing but like big hard cocks, what you're actually finding are writings by authors saying, you know, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can go up to the club anymore. I don't know if I can have sex safely anymore. I don't know if it's the poppers or just being around other men or if it's something inside me. And it actually took a few years of scientific research before they could say, okay, now we know what HIV is, we know how it works. And in those few years, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of confusion, and a whole lot of people died. And it's something that changed what it meant to be queer, and changed what it meant to do queer art in a really fundamental way. So the queer activism that arose from the HIV epidemic arose on the idea that silence equals death. That being silent about HIV, being silent about being queer, being silent about being forced out of societal norms, it wasn't the virus itself that was killing people, but it was heteronormativity. It was trying to force queer life into a straight box, or into a closet, or into some sort of parody of heterosexual life where we all get married and have babies, that was actually killing people. Because when you do that, what happens is the queer life that actually exists is devalued. And when you devalue life, then you have a state that doesn't particularly care if people are dying, and doesn't move particularly fast on things like approving drugs. So I'm going to read you some poetry, because why the fuck not? And this is written by Essex Hemphill. So Hemphill eventually in the late 80s died himself, but he was writing as an activist, as a queer activist during the HIV epidemic, and he was writing as a black gay man at the end of the civil rights movement, realizing that actually he hadn't gained what he had hoped to gain from his activism. And I'm just going to read you a couple of excerpts from the poem Heavy Breathing. Heavy Breathing is a story, or a poem, but it tells a story about another man he was in love with, or another man he lusted after anyways, who only wanted to fuck white men, who was himself in love with whiteness. And so the tension he felt, trying to be with this man, wanting to be with this man, eventually watching him die, but at the same time knowing that what this man valued was actually white supremacy and was actually erasing black queer life in favor of a more normative life. And I just want to put two passages sort of side by side. So first he says, science continues dismantling chromosomes, tampering with genetic codes. I am sure of this as I witness Washington change its eye color from brown to blue. What kind of mutants are we now? Why is some destruction so beautiful? And then a little later on, he's writing about this man that he's attracted to. And he says, occasionally I love to fuck, or I long to fuck a dead man I never slept with. I pump up my temperature, imagining his touch as I stroke my wishbone, wanting to raise him up alive, wanting my fallen seed to produce him, full grown and breathing heavy when it shoots across my chest, wanting him upon me, alive and aggressive, intent on his sweet buggery, even if my eyes do lack a trace of blue. So the reason I put these two passages together is because this moment, when everything about queer art and queer activism changed, is the moment when the queer post-human, I call him the queer zombie, sort of came to life. And he comes to life in this poem, sort of splattered across the author's or the protagonist's chest as semen. And from that semen, this dead man comes back to life and fucks his lover. And it's a great scene, it's a really hot poem, so by all means borrow the book after and read the rest of it. And at the same time that he's feeling this lust for a queer zombie, this lust to make something out of nothing, and to make a kind of person that you can be in a space where there's only things that have been devalued. He's watching the city around him change, and he says Washington is changing its eye color from brown to blue. And what he's describing is the process of gentrification. So as brown families and black families moved out of Washington because they were priced out of the area, and white families moved in, he says, what kind of mutants are we that we've suddenly changed like this? So I put those two beside each other just to get a sense of where post-humanism and queer art is coming from. And this really sort of ambivalent space it comes from, because at the same time that we know that things are changing and not necessarily changing for the good, or not necessarily changing for the kind of good that we would describe as justice, it might be some other kind of good. That also there's something really attractive and really kind of cool about this, and even potentially liberating for people who have never been able to look at the dominant norm and say, yes, I could be that. To be able to make a whole new monstrous body out of nothing and call it beautiful and fall in love with it is actually a really attractive idea. And also what came out of the queer movement is queer theory. And I'm going to go through this really quickly and as simply as I can, because I know I can't actually see you guys, but I know when I say to my students, oh, queer theory, then their eyes kind of glaze over. And I say Judith Butler, and they go, woo! So it's okay. Judith Butler had an idea that gender is performative. She wrote many, many very long, unnecessarily thick essays about it. But the point that gender is performative is that gender isn't something you have, it's not something you are, it's something you do. And it's not something you do once, it's something you do over and over and over and over again. So every day I get up and I put on clothes that, if not necessarily show my body, then at least show the outline of my body so you know what gender I am. And if I didn't do that, it would be really, really confusing. Every day I go out and I deal with people and I talk to other people knowing what gender they're performing. And sometimes people will call me a fucking bitch and say, oh, she's got that butch dyke bitch personality, which is a quote. True fact from one of my colleagues. Because I'm supposed to behave in a particular way. There's a gender performance that I'm supposed to be doing and I'm not doing it right. So I'm kind of mean and I'm kind of blunt and I don't do femininity very well. So I don't do girl very well and I have a bitchy butch type personality. That's an example of how a gender performance can go wrong. And when we see gender performances go wrong, that's where it kind of clicks for us. Especially if we've been doing it right all along. That, oh, I wasn't born with this. It's something I do. So that's Judith Butler in a nutshell. As all of these ideas are coming out, as all of this art is coming together, all of these new, and I put it in scare quotes because they weren't really new, these are political movements that have been going on for a long time, but newly recognized social movements started challenging the ideas of what sex could be. So starting from the idea that gender is performative, we said, wait a minute, what if sex is performative too? So not just man or woman, but what if male and female is more something that you do on a daily basis than something that you actually are? And you can look to the science behind that by looking, people's chromosomes aren't always what they're supposed to be. Their testosterone and estrogen levels aren't always what they're supposed to be. Genitals are funny looking. They look really different. There's a range of different breast sizes among women, a range of different vulva shapes, a range of different penis shapes. And it's actually kind of hard to nail down in a concise way what constitutes male and what constitutes female. So people thought, oh, maybe that's performative too. And we get all of these new ideas of what we can be. So we can be queer. Are you gay? Are you straight? Are you bi? No, I'm queer. Figure it out for yourself. You can be kinky. Suddenly sex isn't just like penis and vagina. It's tying people up and hitting them with sticks and breaking eggs on their faces and smooshing pies on them and popping balloons, squishing bugs, feet, like all of these really wonderful, crazy things that can be sexual and can be sex. And when those things can be sex, and we can't point to this narrow definition of sex, then we kind of pull the rug out from under some of these sites of sexual regulation, because if this isn't sex, then what exactly is our basis for things like marriage, for things like tradition? So that's the idea behind that. Sex can also be commercial, so in the 1970s and 1980s is when the prostitutes' rights movement really picked up steam and started opening sex worker organizations and started saying that if sex is performative, if gender is performative, then we can actually marketize this performance and we can sell it. And we can do that without having to sell our bodies and souls at the same time. Sex can be changed. It can be surgically reassigned, prosthetics can be added, taken away. You can, and people started a movement for recognition of trans people's rights. Again, this is boiling since before Stonewall, but suddenly we see that legislation asking for protection. We see new conversations about who and how and where we're going to use the bathroom to make sure that people are safe using the washrooms they're most comfortable in. And then there's the idea that you don't have to be on the gender binary at all. So not just are you gay, are you straight, are you bi? No. Are you a man, are you a woman, are you androgynous? No. Figure it out yourself. And here I wanted a clip of queer dinosaurs so badly. And it sucks, because when we get to the end of this conversation, we're going to talk a bit about intellectual property and copyright. And I can't rent Jurassic Park on the internet because of copyright law. sorry. There's this great scene in Jurassic Park when it first came out in 1993 and when it was re-released last year, and I don't think the timing is coincidental. There's this wonderful scene where the dude and the two little kids he's got with him are like, oh my god, the dinosaurs are gonna get us. And then he's like, don't worry, you know, dinosaurs, they're all female, they can't reproduce, so at least there's a limited number of dinosaurs to eat us. And then they find an egg that's broken and they're like, oh, they used frog DNA, the dinosaurs can change their sex. And it's the end of the fucking world. And it's this really weird point in an otherwise completely innocuous and kind of scary, I found it scary, but kind of scary movie, but where all of these gendered issues, all of these political movements that have been just boiling under the surface, come to the surface and actually announce themselves as, hey, we're here, we're terrifying, you're gonna be eaten. So it's a great scene, and I'm really sorry that copyright says I can't show it to you. I hope I did it justice describing it. So, you would think, coming from this wonderful, wild world of poetry and activism and sit-ins in the middle of the streets of New York, that we would have, you know, a queer political movement, a visible, effective, totally different from straight people, queer political movement. And I'm not sure that we do. I mean, I think we have little shreds and bits and pieces of it. But I think if you were to tell me that when you went out in the world, all of the gay people you know want to get married and adopt a baby, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that. And I wouldn't hold it against you that somehow you haven't been trained in radical queer politics all your life, because they just ceased to exist. And what happened was neoliberalism. So to run through it again really quickly, because it's another one of those eye-glazing, like, political economy moments. From the 70s until now, how we do economy has changed. We've moved from an economy of production and consumption to an economy where consumption is increasingly regulated to justify production. So you put on your gender, you put on goth or punk or queer, you put on all of these products that say who you are, and this increasingly niche appeal to individualism justifies the production of goods. And it keeps us all working, which is good, sort of. Keeps us all working in really shitty jobs. But it also keeps us all consuming all the time. And while this is happening, the security state is growing. So to protect capital, to protect the nation, we have more surveillance cameras, we have increasingly militarized borders. We have technology that watches us everywhere we go, every second we spend in public. This is a drastic change to what public space is. And while that's happening, the welfare state is disappearing. So Ontario worker welfare rates compared to the real value of money are falling. There's less there to take care of you, especially if you don't have that family unit with benefits and things like that, than there was in the past. Tuition rates skyrocket. The amount of government money that goes to public services, from infrastructure to education to healthcare, gets slowly cut away and replaced with public-private partnerships, replaced with charitable donations, or replaced with downloading that responsibility first onto the provinces, then to the municipalities, and then to families. And this has actually been paradoxically good for queers. So once upon a time, if you were queer and you were poor and you needed welfare, you had to go and see the welfare lady. And the welfare lady would say, who is this person that you live with? And that could be a problem for a lot of people. Now there's no welfare state, or an increasingly cut back welfare state. If you're queer and you're poor, you're kind of just fucked. So you don't go see the welfare lady. If you're on welfare, they'll mail your welfare check to you because they don't want people getting together at the welfare office and talking to each other, because bad things come of that. So as the state moved out of people's social lives and moved out of people's family lives, queer people actually faced less surveillance than in the past. And suddenly there's room for us to, you know, fuck other women without people going, you. But at the same time, we have to do it in particular ways. We have to have the money to do it. We have to have the space to do it, which means we have to be allowed into the neighborhoods where we want to do it. We have to look the right way, talk the right way, be educated the right way. Queer life is increasingly a matter of, as all of our lives are, is increasingly a matter of market forces. So that's what happened to queer radicalism, is capitalism kind of bought it. And now when we do look at gay and lesbian political movements, what we see are the human rights campaign, let's get married, campaigns for adoption, let's have some straight babies, and the kind of activism that went on that was sitting in the streets, demanding new drugs, taking care of queer elders who were sick, and that sort of stuff just sort of slips away. It's not that people stop doing it, but it stops being political and starts being private. And I kind of already touched on this, but after neoliberalism came from the 70s through the 2000s, we had September 11th. It's another one of those moments. Things drastically changed, but they had been boiling for a long time. And these new technologies that once were maybe something we play with or maybe something that we look to for hope are actually a daily part of our lives in a way that is really scary. So the state is increasingly involved in regulating life itself. And one example of this, I wish I could give you like hundreds of examples of this, but one example of this is until 2009, 2010 or so, people with HIV weren't allowed to cross the border into the United States. And that regulation is something that happens at the level of blood, at the level of viral load. And even though that part was overturned, so if you have HIV, you can now cross into the United States, provided you don't have a criminal record, provided you're not a known prostitute. The criminalization of HIV, using these technologies, using surveillance, using public health as a form of surveillance actually continues. Which brings me to, everyone is terrible. Because, holy shit, everything is terrible. So we have the criminalization of HIV. People are going to jail for failing to disclose their HIV status to their partners. For failing, as sex workers, for failing to disclose their HIV status to their clients. And what's often happening is new Canadians, Black Canadians, gay men, and female sex workers are going to jail for failing to disclose their HIV status. So it's actually the people who are already in a position of limited power, who are already under increased surveillance, who have limited economic power, and who might be in a really dangerous situation if they want to try to disclose their HIV status. Because if I'm a sex worker and I have a 100% chance of my kid starving if I don't make some money tonight, and a 50% chance that if I tell this client that I have HIV, he's going to beat the shit out of me, and maybe a 1% chance that if I don't tell him I might get caught and go to jail, what's the reasonable thing for me to do? So that's the criminalization of HIV. We have the criminalization of sex work. And you might think that this is not technological, but the sex work movement has increasingly moved online, and so has resistance to it. You have state senators in the United States going, oh my fucking God, there's prostitutes on Twitter. This is major headline news. There were legislative debates about prostitutes on Twitter. And the response from social media and other technological and sort of techno-economic platforms is to say, okay, we'll get rid of the prostitutes. The homophobia, you can call people fags and dykes and niggers and throw out disgusting graphic pictures of being tortured to death. But if PayPal knows you're a prostitute, they're going to take away your PayPal account. If they know you're a porn star, a legally working porn star, they're going to take away your PayPal account. Banks will cancel your accounts. And in Canada, of course, we have Bill C-36, which has taken the criminalization of sex work to a whole new level. So we have this 7-year-long battle to get rid of prostitution laws in the name of sex workers' human rights. And the second that's completed, a new law put in place that's essentially the same law with different words, based on this idea that, no, actually we're not sure that we want them to have human rights. And I want to talk about this some more, but I I think I'm maybe going to skip it because I didn't bring my phone up here and I don't know how long I've been talking. But if you want to hear about it some more, then you can ask me when we're through. And then the last sort of example of everything is terrible that I wanted to give you is porn monopolies. Because on one hand, it's actually kind of cool that it works this way, and on the other hand, once you see your porn kind of going this way, it's like, oh my god. So probably everyone in this room has gone on Pornhub and looked at porn before. Pornhub is a very interesting company. It was started by Canadians, I believe in 2006. And they were very, very, very good at search engine optimization. The owners of Pornhub never set foot on a porn set. They were just really good at distributing stuff on the internet without charging people money. And people like to get stuff on the internet without paying for it. So Pornhub grew and grew and grew to the point that today, if you make porn and if you want to act in porn, you will see yourself on Pornhub. And the content producers of porn are actually fighting with their owner, Pornhub, to get their own copyrighted material off of the internet. So you have this porn monopoly. And a lot of cool stuff happens with this because suddenly independent porn producers can upload their own work to Pornhub and get it out there when otherwise, Vivid might not buy it. It's not Jenna Jameson, you'd never see it. But on the other hand, as these sites of distribution become the economic force in a business, then the satellite sites of production are marked by increasingly deteriorating working conditions. So casualization, lower pay, lower rates of unionization, lower occupational health and safety standards. And so bad stuff happens at the same time. And one of the things that I think could actually be bad, now I have to do technology. I can talk about technology, I don't know what we're doing. Oh, I should tell you, we're going to look at some implicit. So one of my questions about what's happening is what's happening to our sexual imaginations. So imagine you are a pornography studio, you want to make a video and you want to sell it to one of the various companies owned by this porn monopoly. This is Disgraced 18, it's like a BDSM sort of theme with young women. You have to make sure you produce the right kind of video, and I can look at this and show you the brightly colored bondage tapes, the candy jewelry, the weird vulva and nipple pumps, the bright colors down in the corner with the childish playing act, and things like that become necessary images. You can't not show them, because if you don't show them, then you can't sell them to the particular site of distribution that you want to send them to. So one of the things that's happening to us as this economic change is happening to how we produce and distribute and consume porn is that even though more people and more independent artists can produce pornography, overall, the images we're seeing are becoming more and more limited and more tropic, and repeated over and over and over again. So if we go back to those performance ideas about gender, and that performance that's repeated over and over and over until it seems like a natural thing, then we actually have a bit of a problem here. And another example of how that became a problem, I'm sure you all read 50 Shades of Grey, cover to cover. I read 2.5 books of it, and then I just couldn't take any more of like, oh my gosh, he touched me down there, which is E.L. James's version of dirty talk. But this is Twilight. Copied. The characters are copied, their relationships are copied, they're given new names, they're given a new world, and it's represented to us as fiction. But it's actually that same performance over and over and over again. And it almost seems like a radical thing. It almost seems like remix culture taking back from the corporate machine, you know, and putting out our own sort of kinky idea of sexuality, except that the relationships in Twilight are kind of abusive and rapey. People don't really consent to sex when they have sex. It's not actually a good thing. So E.L. James is another example of something that has that radical potential, has that sort of liberatory idea to it, but actually gets reclaimed by capital very quickly. We don't have to look at these pictures anymore. And now I can figure out how to get back. Keep my PowerPoint. Now I have to figure out which one I have to call.
Like 30 minutes.
Oh, okay. I can just go on and on. There, everything's terrible. We talked about that. Okay, but I didn't want to like totally depress everybody. So yeah, everything is terrible. There are real drastic material changes to how we make erotic art, how we distribute erotic art, how we consume erotic art. But as I said, within those changes, there's those itty bitty little bits of space where new ideas about what it means to be a sexual person, new ideas about what it means to be political, actually can sort of squish their way in. So I wanted to show you some of those because they're awesome. And we'll watch them and I'll try to think of some cool things to say about them, and then I'll say the cool things afterwards. But mostly I just wanted to show them to you because they're awesome. That's okay. We'll start with So this is a movie by the performance artist Gisley. Gisley is a genderqueer feminist porn producer and actor. They've won a number of feminist porn awards over the years, and they've produced some really cool work. And the reason I wanted to pick this one out is to get back to that idea of the queer post-human and these different shapes of bodies that are coming to life in this context. Is that I thought this was a really interesting take on the idea of prosthetic bodies. So we're going to look at prosthetic bodies, we're going to look at undead bodies, and we're going to look at copied bodies, and then maybe we can start to think and talk about what these different ideas of being post-human might mean for legislation and political economy and all of those ideas and things. This is by Lola.
I feel so happy that I have the most beautiful and lovable wife in the world. And I brought a little surprise with me. It's in my back in the hallway. Can you please carry it for us? And the Lights Lighthouse Productions release. You know what? Sometimes I'm really tired of this artificial things. I wish we had a political one.
You mean aisle building? Would you marry Joseph? Sex.
This is Ellie Zombie by the Toronto video artist Chris Hertz. I'm not going to introduce it, I'm just going to show you If you want to bring them back to life because you're a caring, passionate person, just find whatever mold they got in them. Okay. Okay, so there you go. Some things are cool. And where I'm at with this right now, because as I said, I'm a little underprepared and I've been playing with babies all week and been working on this, is actually like a whole lot of questions about what we do with these itty bitty little niches and spaces to make them a little bit bigger. And for me, because I tend to think in terms of policy, these are actually questions of like legislation. So one of my big questions is, as we hack our bodies, as we play with our biodildos, and oh, there's this really neat new dildo. It came out just like a couple of months ago, and it's a dildo that you wear, and it sends a signal back to a vibrator that you can also wear. So if you're wearing this fake cock and somebody strokes or sucks your cock, then it actually, you feel it via the vibrator, and the different pressure and different kinds of touch will produce different sensations. So it is like a prosthetic dick that you can fuck with and have sucked and feel those, not the same sensations, but feel some sensations as if it's really yours. So as we play with our biodildos and our not biodildos, and start changing things about our bodies, all of these questions of who actually owns that technology, who owns the signal that your dick sends to your vibrator if you decide to record it. Do you own it? Does the person performing own it? Does the company that makes it own it? And increasingly with the various types of technology that we use to record, I have a friend who like records the consistency of her poo. I'm not sure if this is normal behavior. Like, I don't know if maybe this is something that you guys do, but I have a friend who like records the number of steps he takes in a day. And then the app emails him if he's almost at 10,000 steps. It's like, go you! To get him to those 10,000. And all of this data is data about our bodies that goes all sorts of very strange places and actually is not necessarily owned by the bodies producing it. So there are questions about intellectual property, about production contexts, especially in terms of porn, about labor conditions, royalties for performers are almost unheard of in porn, and where the money goes as we're using new technologies to change how we do gender and how we do sex and how we do our own bodies. And then there's the question of how we actually get from private to public with these politics, because it's great if I can take a porno home and watch it with my partner and have awesome sex pretending that, you know, she's a dinosaur, I'm a unicorn, we're gonna make some dinocorns. But in the grand scheme of things, all that really does is make my life somewhat more interesting for a few hours. So how do we take these private explorations with what we can be and do with gender and sexuality and turn them into public politics and turn them into solid, effective questions about what we're going to be and do as communities? Maybe that goes through legislation. There are a lot of queers who have a lot of concerns about things like hate crimes and human rights legislation, because once it's on the books, it doesn't always work in our favor. Take, for example, legislation related to sex work. It goes on the books in the name of protecting women and ends up throwing women in jail. So there are questions about how do we make these things public? How do we make child porn legislation that actually prevents the making of child porn versus sexualizing and criminalizing children's bodies themselves and having teenagers thrown in jail for sexting? Because God knows teenagers are going to fuck whether we want them to or not. What do we do besides criminalization? How do we create public policy that actually opens up those spaces instead of closing them down and reclaiming them in the name of capital, patriarchy, and colonization? And then in maybe a more philosophical or more existential way, like what do we actually want to be? Is gender a performance? Is it something that we do over and over and over? Or is it prosthetic? Is it something that I strap on and fuck you with and take off when I'm done with it? And I think that kind of question about exactly what gender is and what we're going to do with it personally and politically will influence our answers to the other questions about how do we create legislation that uses sex as a site for resistant politics instead of as a site for regulation, and how do we reclaim and actually autonomously own our bodies. And that's all I got for you.